O'Donnell with Anthony Mason at CBS News headquarters in New York. Good day. President Obama is about to make his first public comments on the deadly shooting last night at a historic church in Charleston, South Carolina.
The alleged shooter, 21-year-old Dylan Roth, was arrested this morning without incident during a traffic stop. Officers took him into custody in Shelby, North Carolina, about 200 miles northwest of Charleston. You're going to be looking at some live pictures now showing the police on the scene. That is the four-door sedan that he was apprehended in that police have been looking for all morning.
And police say that Roth entered the Emmanuel AME Church during a Bible study meeting last night. He spent an hour there before opening fire. 9 people were killed and 3 men and 6 women. The dead include the pastor, South Carolina State Senator Clementa Pinckney, a 41-year-old father of 2.
The U.S. Justice Department has opened a hate crimes investigation. As we await the president, let's get the latest from CBS News Justice correspondent Jeff Pegues in Charleston. Jeff?
Well, yeah, investigators believe they have their man. They say they don't think anyone else is tied to this mass shooting here at this church in Charleston, South Carolina. Investigators put out be on the lookout, which is law enforcement jargon for the image and the person that they were looking for earlier this morning. And then late in the morning, they got the identity of the person they were looking for. And not too long after that, they were able to track him down, in part because of tips that were coming in. And it was a tip that investigators say led to the arrest. Let's listen to the president.
Good afternoon, everybody. This morning, I spoke with, and Vice President Biden spoke with Mayor Joe Riley and other leaders at Charleston to express our deep sorrow over the senseless murders that took place last night. Michelle and I know several members of Emmanuel AME Church. We knew their pastor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who, along with 8 others, gathered in prayer and fellowship and was murdered last night. And to say our thoughts and prayers are with them and their families and their community doesn't say enough to convey the heartache and the sadness and the anger that we feel. Any death of this sort is a tragedy. Any shooting involving multiple victims is a tragedy. There is something particularly heartbreaking about a death happening in a place in which we seek solace and we seek peace, in a place of worship. And Mother Emmanuel is, in fact, more than a church. This is a place of worship that was founded by African Americans seeking liberty. This is a church that was burned to the ground because its worshipers worked to end slavery. When there were laws banning all black church gatherings, they conducted services in secret. When there was a nonviolent movement to bring our country closer in line with our highest ideals, some of our brightest leaders spoke and led marches from this church's steps. This is a sacred place in the history of Charleston and in the history of America. The FBI is now on the scene with local police, and more of the Bureau's best are on the way to join them. The Attorney General has announced plans for the FBI to open a hate crime investigation. We understand that the suspect is in custody, and I'll let the best of law enforcement do its work to make sure that justice is served. Until the investigation is complete, I'm necessarily constrained in terms of talking about the details of the case. But I don't need to be constrained about the emotions that tragedies like this raise. I've had to make statements like this too many times. Communities like this have had to endure tragedies like this too many times. We don't have all the facts, but we do know that, once again, innocent people were killed in part because someone who wanted to inflict harm had no trouble getting their hands on a gun. Now is the time for mourning and for healing. But let's be clear. At some point, we as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this kind of frequency. And it is in our power to do something about it. I say that recognizing the politics in this town foreclose a lot of those avenues right now. But it'd be wrong for us not to acknowledge it. And at some point, it's going to be important for the American people to come to grips with it. And for us to be able to shift how we think about the issue of gun violence collectively. The fact that this took place in a black church obviously also raises questions about a dark part of our history. This is not the first time that black churches have been attacked. And we know that hatred across races and faiths pose a particular threat to our democracy and our ideals. The good news is I am confident that the outpouring of unity and strength and fellowship and love across Charleston today, from all races, from all faiths, from all places of worship, indicates the degree to which those old vestiges of hatred can be overcome. That certainly was Dr. King's hope just over 50 years ago, after 4 little girls were killed in a bombing in a black church in Birmingham, Alabama. He said they lived meaningful lives and they died nobly. They say to each of us, Dr. King said, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely with who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. And if one will hold on, he will discover that God walks with him and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace. Reverend Pinckney and his congregation understood that spirit. Their Christian faith compelled them to reach out not just to members of their congregation or to members of their own communities, but to all in need. They opened their doors to strangers who might enter a church in search of healing or redemption. Mother Emanuel Church and its congregation have risen before, from flames, from an earthquake, from other dark times, to give hope to generations of Charlestonians. And with our prayers and our love and the buoyancy of hope, it will rise again now as a place of peace. Thank you.
What would you do differently than done before?
President Obama making remarks at the White House on the shooting in Charleston before leaving for California. He said he and the First Lady know several members of the congregation at the Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. In particular, they knew Reverend Pinckney, the pastor who was, of course, one of the 9 victims, the only identified victim so far. He called the church, which has a deep history in the United States, a sacred place in the history of America. And he said, at some point, we as a country have to reckon with the fact that this kind of mass violence doesn't happen in other countries. Nora, that's a pretty strong statement. It's the 14th time he's had to talk about something like this.
An extraordinarily strong statement from the president, not only mentioning gun violence. He said he's given far too many of these speeches, but I think also the historic nature of this. 52 years since that church in Birmingham, Alabama, and those 4 girls were killed there. The president talking about Martin Luther King and his comments. Martin Luther King actually spoke at this very church where we're talking about this tragedy today. Booker T. Washington spoke at this church. It is one of the most historic churches in America and certainly has the largest black congregation south of Baltimore. So a deeply emotional statement by the president today. And of course, the Justice Department will have more on this as they open up a hate crimes investigation. We're going to have more about this story on your local CBS station and on our 24-hour digital news network, CBSN. It is available on all devices at cbsnews.com. Scott Pelley will be anchoring CBS Evening News from Charleston, South Carolina, and we will have the very latest tomorrow on CBS This Morning. With Anthony Mason, I'm Nora O'Donnell, CBS News, New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.